The last gunfire fell silent in the shattered concrete. No orders to retreat came, and no organized lines remained to follow them. Surrender in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad on the 2nd of February 1943 was only a prologue. The survivors would face labor camps that very few would ever leave, but their long march began here in the deep snow. The contrast with the previous summer defied comprehension. Back in August 1942, General Friedrich Paulus marched 300,000 men toward the city limits. This force matched the entire modern population of Geneva, advancing across the steppe as an organized tide under the sun. Paulus expected the city to fall within a matter of weeks. But November brought Operation Uranus and the collapse of the German flanks. Soviet forces executed a rapid double envelopment, severing the supply corridors. Over 250,000 soldiers suddenly found themselves trapped in a freezing pocket of death. The cauldron stripped away military discipline and left only basic survival instincts. Biting wind lashed through the skeletal buildings at -40 degrees Celsius. The deep freeze turned uniforms stiff with ice, freezing sweat directly to the skin, while gangrene blackened unwashed toes. Soldiers huddled in dark cellars, burning whatever wood they could pry from the rubble. The Sixth Army ceased all operations, dropped its rifles into the snow, and stood in place to await capture. While the troops waited for capture in the ruins, Berlin sent one final message. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler promoted their commander to Field Marshal. This rank was never meant as a reward for battlefield service. No German commander of that stature had ever been taken alive. The promotion was a direct, unspoken demand for an honorable suicide. Friedrich Paulus rejected the order. The very next day, January 31st, he formalized the defeat. He surrendered to Soviet officers deep inside the cramped, unheated basement of the Univermag department store. While the general signed papers in the dark, his soldiers surrendered on the freezing streets above. The physical state of the Sixth Army completely shattered Berlin's expectations. Temperatures plunged to between -30 and -40 degrees Celsius. High Command had promised 700 tons of daily supply drops. In reality, cargo planes delivered less than 100 tons to the snow. By February 2nd, the last disorganized pockets of resistance collapsed without a fight. Soldiers began crawling out from the shattered concrete across the city. 91,000 troops staggered into the blinding winter daylight. This sheer volume of prisoners could fill every single seat in Wembley Stadium. Every man in that vast, shivering crowd needed immediate food and surgical intervention. Neither existed in the destroyed sectors. Exhausted men raised their bare hands, exposing stiff fingers blackened by severe frostbite. Filthy coats hung off skeletal frames, hiding deep, infected shrapnel wounds. The 91,000 standing captives were no longer a functional combat force, but a paralyzed, rotting mass of hypothermia and starvation. 91,000 men staggered out of the ruins to begin a long march east, where keeping the rags on their backs was no longer guaranteed. Losing a single stolen coat reduced a man's life expectancy to a mere handful of hours in the wind. The winter of 1943 offered zero margins for survival. Soviet troops accepting the surrender had fought for months in the same ruins, lacking regular supplies and empathy. Guards stripped watches from wrists, but more lethally, they demanded heavy coats and intact winter boots. Fabric tore and leather snapped as captors physically ripped the warm outer layers directly off the freezing prisoners. A captive left standing in thin shirt sleeves felt the sub-zero wind cut straight to the bone. The sheer volume of captives overwhelmed any theoretical rules, turning the frozen steppe into a landscape of mutual dehumanization. Food did not exist, and medical care remained a distant fiction for the columns advancing eastward. The loss of footwear forced men to wrap bare feet in bloody rags, slowing their pace across the ice. Those who lost their warm clothing faced weather that killed far faster than enemy bullets. The marching columns stretched for kilometers across the snow, leaving behind men who lacked the physical insulation to continue walking. Falling behind meant a final rest on the frozen earth. Without movement, they froze in hours. Thousands of sick soldiers lay directly on the frozen soil among torn tents and shattered barracks. Those who survived the march reached the Beketovka transit camp, a place that quickly became an open-air graveyard. Between 35,000 and 45,000 men died here in the first few weeks alone. Typhus and dysentery spread through the tightly packed crowds. The sharp stench of infected feces and rotting flesh filled the ruined structures. Soviet authorities lacked the infrastructure to process this sudden mass of humanity. Water sources were contaminated. Medical care did not exist. Food distributions were absent during the initial days, leaving the weakened men with nothing to burn for body heat. Men simply lay down. They succumbed to severe exhaustion, hypothermia, and untreated shrapnel wounds. The mortality rate in some sectors exceeded 50% within a single month. A strict hierarchy determined who survived. 24 generals had surrendered alongside Friedrich Paulus. Guards immediately separated them from the dying mass of enlisted men. Vehicles took the high-ranking officers away to specialized facilities far from the disease vectors. They received beds, regular meals, and extensive interrogations. Soviet intelligence prepared them for political manipulation. Meanwhile, mid-ranking officers formed a second tier, isolated in slightly better conditions. The vast majority of captives, the non-commissioned officers and privates, remained behind in the snow to freeze. Historian Rudiger Overmans documented this catastrophic collapse. The transition from surrender to formal internment wiped out half the army before processing even began. This specific death toll surpassed the combat losses of many major active military campaigns. A 93% mortality rate defined the captivity of the Sixth Army. The initial transit zones sealed their fate before they ever boarded trains to the permanent labor camps deep in the interior. Out of the 91,000 men captured at Stalingrad, exactly 6,000 returned to Germany. The men who left Beketovka dissolved into the NKVD bureaucratic network. The Soviet Union had ratified treaties protecting captured combatants. Officially, these prisoners fell under the Geneva Convention. In practice, they became a sheer physical resource for forced labor. The state ran two parallel detention tracks. The Gulag absorbed Soviet citizens convicted of crimes. Captured enemy soldiers went into the GUPVI network, a directorate built for foreign internees. On paper, they remained separate. On the ground, they shared the same infrastructure, guards, and operational guidelines. By 1945, the GUPVI managed hundreds of these specialized sites. A prisoner of war faced the exact same exploitation as a political convict. Both directorates evaluated human bodies through identical metrics of physical output. NKVD biologists measured life in joules and grams. They calculated daily rations strictly to maintain a prisoner's ability to swing a pickaxe, leaving zero margin for recovery. The standard allowance hovered around 2,000 calories, barely covering basal metabolic needs in the cold. Quotas dictated food delivery. Camp administrators distributed meals based on the exact energy expenditure required for the worker's next shift. A German soldier lowered his heavy tool. He missed his daily quota. That evening, the quartermaster handed him a reduced slice of black bread. In this vast network, a captive's life carried no intrinsic value. His existence was measured exclusively in tons of extracted coal and chopped timber. Pickaxes struck the frozen rock deep inside the Donbass mines. The sharp, metallic clinks echoed through the dark shafts. The biological math offered no mercy. A prisoner who failed to meet his extraction target received less food. The next morning, his starved muscles lacked the strength to swing the iron tools. He mined even less coal. The camp administrators cut his ration again. He grew weaker. He worked slower. This downward spiral turned a living man into a frozen corpse within a few weeks. Less work meant less food. Less food guaranteed a rapid death. This lethal mechanism operated far beyond a single mining facility. The state distributed the Stalingrad survivors across more than 350 labor camps. The geographical web spanned 11 time zones. It stretched from the heavy industrial zones of the Urals to the dense, freezing forests of Siberia. It reached down to the Caucasus Mountains and the remote plains of Central Asia. The administration cared little for the specific type of labor. Captives rebuilt cities devastated by artillery fire. They laid railway tracks across barren landscapes. They operated steel furnaces and cut heavy timber. Often they dug the frozen earth shoulder to shoulder with Soviet political convicts. Two groups of bitter enemies shared the same freezing mud under the watch of the same armed guards. Disease constantly swept through the unheated wooden barracks. Typhus and dysentery claimed thousands of lives. Tuberculosis spread rapidly in the cramped quarters. Chronic malnutrition turned healthy young men into walking skeletons, prone to fatal workplace accidents. During the first 2 years of captivity, the death rate in these facilities hovered between 3 and 8% every single month. These monthly mortality percentages continuously accumulated in the classified archives of the NKVD. Soviet record keepers cataloged those mounting losses while simultaneously securing a different fate for a select few. 24 men out of 91,000 received a chance at survival simply because of the stars on their shoulder boards. While privates collapsed from typhus in the freezing Donbass coal mines, their former commanders read fresh books inside special facilities. Moscow recognized that ordinary infantrymen were merely expendable labor. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his 23 subordinate generals, however, represented a highly valuable political asset. Soviet authorities transferred this elite group from the frontline ruins to secluded compounds near Moscow. The captured command staff enjoyed heated individual rooms and decent food rations instead of freezing labor assignments. NKVD interrogators maintained regular contact with the captives, carefully extracting tactical knowledge about Wehrmacht operations. The Soviet leadership provided this cynical comfort in direct exchange for long-term political utility. The investment in these captive commanders materialized into a formal propaganda campaign by July of 1943. With direct support from their captors, the generals participated in the creation of the National Committee for a Free Germany. The Kremlin needed a message that could reach across the Eastern Front, targeting both trenches and the civilian population. 24 high-ranking officers became an instrument against their own state. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach pulled a wooden chair to a polished desk inside a heated Moscow office. He prepared to draft a message to his troops. While ordinary soldiers of the 6th Army marched into snowy oblivion, their commanders found another path to survival. The Soviet capital sat nearly 1,000 kilometers away from the freezing trenches. Out there, 91,000 captives faced starvation and typhus in the transit camps. In here, high-ranking officers received fresh ink and clean paper. In July 1943, Soviet authorities launched the National Committee for a Free Germany. The organization merged exiled communists with the captured elite. Seydlitz-Kurzbach became the most active participant among the brass. The static crackle of radio broadcasts carried his voice over the snowdrifts of the Eastern Front. By August 1944, this escalating campaign would push Adolf Hitler to permanently brand Paulus a traitor. Friedrich Paulus originally avoided this political work during his first year of captivity. His isolation fractured after the failed assassination attempt against the German Chancellor on July 20, 1944. The dynamic shifted entirely within a month. A clean desk awaited him in a warm room. Paulus picked up a fountain pen. He pressed the metal nib against crisp white paper. He signed a direct appeal urging German soldiers to end the war. The ink from those signatures transformed into radio waves. They swept the Eastern Front. Months earlier, these same commanders issued direct attack orders from secure field headquarters. Now, the reality shifted. Their familiar voices echoed through Soviet loudspeakers, urging their own infantry to surrender. Moscow designed the League of German Officers for this exact psychological operation. The political strategy aimed to attract a conservative military elite that traditionally despised communists. Heavy transmitters blasted recorded appeals directly into the frontline trenches, day and night. This political weapon targeted freezing soldiers in the snow. Among the high-ranking captives in Moscow, individual motivations varied. Some generals calculated the inevitable military defeat of their homeland, choosing to act on new anti-Nazi convictions. Others traded their military oaths for better rations and warmer sleeping quarters. These political games contrasted with the grim fate of 91,000 prisoners of war. But not everyone broke. A fraction of the officer corps refused any collaboration and chose permanent isolation. While generals broadcasted from Moscow studios, physician Hans de Bold tracked typhus outbreaks in the camp mud. He worked with 0 medications. 91,000 men surrendered at Stalingrad. Official statistics recorded neat mortality numbers, but de Bold's secret clinical diaries detailed the reality of rotting wounds. He wrote his observations on scraps of paper. He documented the exact stages of gangrene. Whenever guards approached the block, he hid the clinical notes under his clothes. The wooden barracks smelled heavily of decaying flesh and sour typhus sweat. 91,000 people equaled the population of an entire European city, plunged entirely into extreme starvation. The few men who survived returned to Germany in the 1950s. They brought back evidence of physical collapse. Heinrich Gerlach published The Betrayed Army, capturing the daily disintegration of the ranks. General Walter von Brauchitsch added his memoirs to this dark archive of deprivation. Records replaced their tombstones. These final records captured a grim reality, where daily survival quickly erased frontline brotherhood, yielding entirely to the secret police. Men who had shielded each other from bullets in Stalingrad now sold their bunkmates for watery soup. An exhausted prisoner offered a quick, averted glance. A hurried whisper to the interrogator followed. Minutes later, he received a battered metal bowl with a thicker ration. Extra calories and a coveted warm spot by the iron stove became the standard price for denouncing a fellow soldier. The main administration for affairs of prisoners of war operated nearly 300 camps across the country. This system was managed directly by the NKVD, which professionally transferred its domestic methods of political surveillance onto the captured military population. The Wehrmacht hierarchy survived intact behind the wire. Hardline loyalists applied heavy pressure against anyone displaying ideological deviation. The loud crunch of frozen snow under the boots of the convoy guards during morning roll calls underscored this total surveillance. Through this systematic cultivation of informant networks, the NKVD successfully poisoned the relationships between former trench companions. A Catholic priest whispered a Latin prayer in the dark corner of the barracks. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter. Amidst informers and the constant threat of typhus, the prisoners tried to hold on to scraps of their past lives. Faith became a critical psychological resource. Protestant pastors and Catholic priests continued to perform their functions in secret. The Soviets handled these practices with uneven consistency. Sometimes camp commanders permitted limited religious activity. In other months, the authorities actively suppressed any gatherings. The Soviets organized mandatory Russian language courses. Officially, this served practical communication needs. In reality, it was a tool for ideological indoctrination. The men learned enough basic vocabulary to interact with guards. Access to culture depended entirely on the specific camp. Some facilities maintained official propaganda libraries with Marxist texts translated into German. The authorities even allowed restricted theatrical activity. In harsher camps, extreme physical exhaustion made any activity beyond grueling labor impossible. Heinrich Gerlach found a different method to preserve his sanity. He began writing a novel about Stalingrad. He worked in secret. The faint rustle of stolen paper scraps accompanied his nights in the crowded bunks. Eventually, the NKVD discovered his stash. The officers confiscated the entire manuscript during a search. Decades later, Gerlach reconstructed that exact novel from memory using clinical hypnosis. Relations with other nationalities added another layer to the camp dynamic. Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians captured at Stalingrad often shared these freezing compounds. Over 200,000 Axis Allied troops ended up in the Soviet network. Sometimes these different national groups cooperated for mutual survival. Often, captivity merely intensified national tensions. The compounds also housed displaced persons. Civilian workers from countries previously occupied by Germany met the prisoners with open hostility. Survival among hostile civilians carried a clear price for Moscow. The state measured this cost in cubic meters of laid stone. Who would clear the rubble of 1,700 dead cities? Captured enemies provided the answer. Calluses cracked the hands of the very men who previously pulled machine gun triggers. Now they cleared shattered buildings barehanded. Prisoners lifted heavy bricks directly from the ruined foundations. They passed jagged fragments down a long human chain. Gray concrete dust settled heavily on their exhausted faces. The coarse powder embedded deeply into the sweating skin of the work brigades. The invasion had obliterated 70,000 towns across the vast Soviet territory. 1,700 leveled cities meant the entire urban network of the Western Soviet Union required rebuilding from scratch. The nation had lost roughly 27 million citizens. The front consumed the prime working generation. Moscow desperately needed raw physical power to plug this demographic void. Foreign captives supplied that essential muscle. By the end of the war, the forced labor army numbered more than 3 million men. 101 kilometers of the Volga-Don Canal passed through the hands of German prisoners. Out of that vast captive force, the surviving soldiers were sent straight into the ruins they had previously shattered. They started by clearing the rubble of Stalingrad. The geography of their forced labor expanded steadily alongside the progressing reconstruction. They rebuilt the broken avenues of Kharkov and the leveled districts of Kiev. Quotas soon encompassed the restoration of damaged zones inside Moscow and Leningrad. Far beyond the cities, they dug deep coal mines across the Donbass and the Urals and laid rails across the Siberian permafrost. The Volga-Don waterway opened in 1952. The canal stretched for 101 kilometers, and the vast majority of the earthworks were completed by hand. Engineers with specialized technical education were transferred into closed Soviet laboratories. To ensure the rest of this massive workforce could rebuild Stalingrad and Kyiv, Soviet logistics had to change their approach. The death rate in the camps began to drop, not out of sudden humanity, but due to strict accounting. A dead prisoner swung no pickaxe. Keeping them alive became an economic necessity. The camp doctor walked down the line of emaciated men. He checked their sunken chests for signs of disease. His only metric was whether the prisoner possessed enough muscle to lift a heavy tool. A hollow cough echoed through the cold wooden barracks every night. Between 1943 and 1944, the extreme conditions decimated the ranks. By 1945, the survival strategy shifted toward long-term exploitation. Heavy construction labor demands at least 3,500 kilocalories a day. The German prisoners received only a critical minimum. This was not a matter of deliberate torture. The entire post-war Soviet Union faced severe food shortages. The local population was starving, and rations stayed low simply because the country had nothing left to give. An epidemic of tuberculosis swept through the crowded camps. It continued to kill men long after the fighting had stopped. Yet the physical labor never paused. They dug deep trenches and poured the massive foundations of industrial plants along the Don and the Volga rivers. These men had marched east just a few years earlier to conquer this exact territory. Now they mixed concrete to restore it. Between 1945 and 1955, they rebuilt the very ruins they had created. Many buildings in Soviet cities still stand today on bricks laid by German hands. Physical exertion among the rubble of Soviet cities eventually met a new requirement from the NKVD. Walter Ulbricht stood before rows of emaciated prisoners, his sharp German syllables echoing loudly through the freezing wooden barracks. In a few years, these captive listeners would become the foundational bureaucracy of a new East German state. Bread meant everything. They absorbed Marxist history simply to secure another meager meal. The establishment of anti-fascist schools became a standard procedure across the camp network after 1945. The ideological curriculum focused on the history of the workers' movement and a thorough critique of German militarism. Prisoners sat on wooden benches to listen to mandatory lectures, presenting the Soviet state as the model for the future. The process of receiving a reward depended on basic physiology. Hunger dictated their daily compliance. A captive soldier listened to the verbal dismantling of his former military ideals. He then demonstrated his newfound ideological alignment to the supervising political officers. In exchange for this verbal obedience, the camp administration handed him an increased ration of black bread. The officers also granted him the rare privilege of writing a letter home. Those who resisted the curriculum found their daily living conditions immediately downgraded. This pragmatic exchange of ideology for calories laid the groundwork for the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or the SED. The SED would eventually govern a post-war state containing 16 million citizens. Yet the actual effectiveness of these Soviet lectures remained questionable even decades later. They faked belief. Many men simply learned to navigate the camp rules, speaking the required socialist phrases while keeping their true thoughts hidden. They eventually boarded the returning trains to Germany, leaving their temporary Marxist vocabulary behind in the barracks. Researchers unsealed dusty folders in reunified Germany. The Berlin Wall had just fallen in 1990. They found familiar names buried inside the Soviet and Eastern Bloc archives. Many graduates of those NKVD lectures had returned to the occupation zone with ready-made party ambitions. Their political trajectories remained hidden for 40 years. The paper trail revealed a distinct pattern within the early decades of the German Democratic Republic. The paradox of this re-education lay in its teachers. Soviet political commissars managed the classroom narratives, yet some of these very instructors had previously passed through the Gulag under Joseph Stalin. They taught Marxist theory to defeated enemies after enduring their own state terror. They helped build a new nation, which officially formed in 1949.
The Soviet denazification process relied on strict social transformation. Classroom rhetoric masked a dark cycle of physical survival. Men who survived Stalinist camps molded the minds of defeated soldiers. A statistically significant fraction of former prisoners eventually secured administrative positions within the East German apparatus.
While selected prisoners studied Marx behind closed doors, another group faced a completely different institutional process. 3,300,000 dead Soviet captives. This death toll exceeded total American military fatalities in the Second World War by almost 8 times. Out of 5,700,000 captured men, 57% perished in German camps. Evidence surfaced daily. SS Einsatzgruppen filled trenches with civilians, and field hospitals burned with patients trapped inside. The scale of these atrocities demanded immediate, public retribution from the state. Krasnodar, July 1943. The front lines had barely moved past the region, and Western allies had not even started planning the Nuremberg trials. Yet Soviet authorities already organized their first major tribunal. They constructed it as a massive social spectacle. Technicians wired heavy radio equipment to damaged street poles, ensuring no one missed the proceedings. Static crackled. Loudspeakers broadcast the harsh voices of prosecutors across the central square. Tens of thousands of exhausted citizens gathered among the rubble, listening to every detail of the occupation. 8 local collaborators and 3 German soldiers stood in the dock. They answered for the mass graves and the destroyed civil infrastructure. The judges delivered the sentences without delay. Guards marched the condemned men directly to the gallows. A ruined city watched the execution.
Following the mass executions in the southern ruins, Soviet tribunals reached the highest command captured at Stalingrad. Foreign generals received 25 years of forced labor in courts where an ordinary Stalinist decree guaranteed a firing squad. Between October and November 1947, Moscow hosted a highly publicized trial for 12 German commanders. The defendants stood in the courtroom, wearing their heavy, tailored uniforms. The guards would soon exchange these garments for the thin robes of the penal colonies. General Hans-Georg Reinhardt, former commander of the 3rd Panzer Army, sat listening to endless translated indictments. The mechanics of these hearings stood in sharp contrast to the international standards established at Nuremberg. Soviet procedures routinely denied the accused any substantial access to an independent defense team. This practice blurred the line between documented evidence and state propaganda.
Yet the underlying atrocities presented in the courtroom remained historically accurate. The systematic destruction of occupied villages was not a fabricated story. It was the physical reality of the territories these 12 men had governed. The judges delivered sentences condemning the officers to decades inside the Soviet camp network. Many convicted commanders perished from disease and exhaustion long before their terms ended. The political climate eventually shifted following the death of the Soviet leadership. Diplomatic negotiations allowed the surviving prisoners of war to return home in 1955. 6,000 survived out of 91,000 prisoners from the Stalingrad pocket. Court verdicts struck dozens of high-ranking officers in Moscow. But the first winter decided the fate of tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers. Between February and April 1943, the death toll reached 35,000 to 45,000 men. 35,000 dead in 3 months equals nearly 400 men dying every single day without a single shot fired. Half of the captured 6th Army perished before seeing the wooden gates of a permanent labor camp. The primary cause of this massive mortality rate was the physiological limit of the human body. February 1943. An icy, piercing wind tore across the frozen steppe during the forced foot marches. Temperatures frequently dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, freezing damp uniforms to the skin. The men surrendered after 2 months of severe starvation inside the encircled pocket. Their bodies possessed zero physiological reserves to survive the extreme cold and the forced marches. Then came the food. A severely emaciated prisoner finally received his long-awaited ration. He eagerly swallowed the hard military bread. But his completely atrophied internal organs failed to restart the digestive process. Doctors treating severe famine victims recognize this fatal metabolic reaction as refeeding syndrome. The sudden intake of carbohydrates triggered an acute electrolyte imbalance. Cardiac arrest followed within a few hours. The exhausted body simply collapsed on the frozen mud. Stomachs refused to process bread.
Those who survived artillery strikes and -40 temperatures faced an unexpected paradox. Their bodies recovered from the thermal shock and processed food. Then they entered the cramped barracks. Here, thousands of soldiers died from simple lice bites. Dysentery struck first. The disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded transit camps, exploiting every vulnerability. Weakened bodies could not fight off basic bacterial infections. Severe dehydration and malnutrition formed a lethal combination. Men died within mere days. Then came epidemic typhus. Body lice efficiently transmitted Rickettsia prowazekii across the permanent camps. Outbreaks devastated populations throughout 1943 and 1944. High fevers swept the unventilated rooms. A characteristic skin rash covered the emaciated bodies lying on the bunks. Without treatment, the mortality rate exceeded 40%. Penicillin and other antibiotics remained completely unavailable to the inmates. Finally, tuberculosis took over. Mycobacterium tuberculosis thrived in these exact conditions. Overcrowding, chronic malnutrition, and constant cold exposure created an ideal breeding ground. The disease advanced slowly. It debilitated prisoners for months before claiming their lives. Severely ill prisoners survived the initial years, but died en masse from tuberculosis in 1947.
Those whose lungs endured the tuberculosis wards were sent down to the coal seams of the Donbass region. An emaciated prisoner descended into the darkness of the heavy industry shaft. He pressed his shoulders against the damp stone walls, simply trying not to collapse from sheer physical exhaustion. Suffocating coal dust filled the stagnant air, mingling with the slow, invisible buildup of toxic mine gases deep underground. These weakened men operated the heavy machinery entirely without protective equipment, inhaling the poison with every desperate breath. Massive cave-ins routinely buried the trapped workers alive beneath the rubble. The unfamiliar geology offered no mercy to the starving foreign laborers. Soviet records meticulously logged the formal executions for escape attempts or minor camp violations. Guards sometimes shot fleeing men on sight. Yet these deliberate killings represented a fraction of the overall mortality statistics. The harsh environmental conditions silently absorbed the remaining lives without ever requiring any formal execution orders. Freedom first came not to the useful, but to those whose lives hung by a thread. The Soviet Union initiated the repatriation in 1945. Pure economic logic drove this strict selection. Authorities systematically discarded men suffering from extreme alimentary dystrophy. Profound malnutrition meant they could no longer swing a pickaxe. Providing medical care offered zero productive return. The system simply dumped its useless human ballast. This grueling process of return would eventually stretch across an entire decade. The initial wave of 1945 and 1946 consisted primarily of the dying. When these hospital trains finally reached German stations, the sight shattered the waiting public. Families rushed forward to greet returning loved ones. Instead, living skeletons stumbled out of the rail cars. Relatives recoiled in sheer horror at their hollowed faces. The severe physical state of the arrivals provoked profound social shock. These broken figures bore no resemblance to the men who had marched away years ago. It took exactly 3 years to return the main mass of the surviving rank and file. Relatively healthy soldiers waited for their turn until 1947. Between that year and 1950, the second wave moved enlisted men and non-commissioned officers across the borders. The political climate of the early Cold War began to directly dictate these release timelines. Soviet leadership realized that holding a massive captive labor force had become a diplomatic burden. Over 1 million prisoners crossed into Germany during this specific window. However, the logic shifted entirely for those convicted of war crimes by military tribunals. Sentences ranging from 20 to 25 years meant a de facto life term inside the penal camps. 25 years. A diplomatic freeze then halted all further organized repatriations until September 1955. The diplomatic deadlock finally broke when Konrad Adenauer landed in Moscow. He brought a specific agenda to the Soviet capital. It was the first official visit by a German leader since the war ended. September 1955. The negotiation rooms felt heavy with tension. Adenauer sat directly opposite Nikita Khrushchev. Thousands of German soldiers remained trapped in Soviet labor camps. Moscow classified these men as convicted war criminals. Bonn viewed them as political hostages. Human lives became a direct currency for state relations. Khrushchev needed official recognition from West Germany to legitimize his new leadership. Adenauer faced a fractured domestic public demanding their fathers back. He needed a concrete victory to justify any normalization with the Soviet government. Men for embassies. The talks stalled, then resumed under intense pressure. Both sides eventually signed the formal agreement to release the remaining captives. Prematurely aged men stepped from the train cars onto the freezing platform. A sharp locomotive horn pierced the cold air at Friedland Station. The diplomatic breakthrough in Moscow had finally unlocked the Soviet camps. Between October 1955 and January 1956, 9,626 prisoners of war arrived in Lower Saxony. Wives rushed forward to embrace husbands they had not seen in a decade. But other men stood completely alone. They scanned the empty concrete. Their families had vanished in the post-war displacement. The British military government originally built the Friedland transit camp in September 1945. Millions of refugees had already passed through its wooden barracks. Now it processed the very last captives. Most of these returnees had surrendered late in the war, but among them walked the final survivors of the Sixth Army. They had endured 12 years of Soviet captivity. The men wore mismatched coats. They carried small wooden suitcases holding everything they owned. Their arrival became an open wound, broadcast across the German press. Friedrich Paulus never saw the Friedland platform. The former Field Marshal returned instead to the German Democratic Republic in 1953. He settled in a villa in the Dresden suburb of Oberlauswitz. The communist government provided him with a car, an adjutant, and a quiet life. The commander who led the Sixth Army into destruction spent his final days giving lectures and writing memoirs. He lived in isolation behind the Iron Curtain. His heart failed in February 1957. He died exactly 14 years after the capitulation. The return of over 9,000 men from the eastern camps exposed the raw scale of a demographic catastrophe. Where did the remaining 84,000 people disappear? Soviet NKVD documents and post-war German archives provided contradictory answers. The counting problem started right on the frozen ice of the ruined city. German troops surrendered in scattered, starving fragments. They yielded to different Red Army units across multiple combat sectors. Extreme winter conditions crippled any organized attempt at proper accounting. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The administrative process broke down on the front lines. Men froze to death on the roads before any Soviet officer could write down their names. Others were marched to collection hubs like the Beketovka transit camp. In the ensuing logistical chaos, guards registered the same prisoners twice at different transfer points along the railway. NKVD reports generated between February and April 1943 showed numerical discrepancies involving thousands of individuals. The motivation behind the ledgers dictated the final numbers. Soviet camp commanders underreported the daily death toll. Hiding the catastrophic mortality rate shielded them from direct accountability to Moscow. Across the border, German clerks faced a different hurdle. Post-war registries relied heavily on fragmented family letters. They built lists using vague statements from exhausted survivors and incomplete captured records. The paperwork of these two states never aligned. In 1999, German historian Rüdiger Overmans published a comprehensive study of this administrative chaos. He processed decades of casualty documentation through the German military agencies. His conclusion finalized the tragic math of the encirclement. Between 90,000 and 95,000 soldiers capitulated at Stalingrad. Only about 6,000 survivors eventually returned to Germany. Despite extensive archival research, a wide margin of uncertainty remains open. Tens of thousands of names dissolved somewhere between the initial capture and the long march to the eastern camps. An entire category of prisoners simply never entered any official document. 1946. The government established a dedicated agency to search for the missing. Those who evaporated from official reports left their families in a profound psychological and legal vacuum. The disappearance began long before the eastern camps. Some prisoners never made it past the initial surrender. In the confusion of the first hours, Soviet frontline troops executed an undetermined number of men right on the spot. No field registry captured these rapid deaths. The bodies simply remained in the snow. Other soldiers blended into the local civilian population, escaping detection but permanently erasing their own names. The post-war German state had to find answers. Deutsche Dienststelle, widely known as WAST, opened its doors to manage the crisis. The work was slow. Clerks opened thousands of handwritten letters from desperate wives and mothers. They cross-referenced faded unit lists against incomplete Soviet transfer records. Archival workers stamped heavy red ink onto thousands of cardboard index cards. The letters marking a soldier as missing dried on the cheap paper. WAST operated as an independent entity until its final merger with the Federal Archives in 2019. Across its entire history, the agency processed over 20 million individual inquiries. Yet, for a notable fraction of the Stalingrad garrison, no records existed anywhere. This bureaucratic silence froze thousands of lives in place. Women lived in a permanent suspended state, unable to move forward with their lives. They could not legally mourn. They could not remarry. The German Catholic Church strictly demanded a formal death certificate to officially recognize a widow as free from marriage. Without that single piece of paper, the missing men remained legally alive. Wives waited for a return that never came. A whole generation of children grew up waiting for a knock at the door. They did not know if their fathers were dead or held in a secret prison. The last surviving prisoners stepped off trains in 1955. They brought grim stories of comrades who fell years ago. These spoken testimonies finally closed the files on some of those suspended cases. While thousands of ordinary soldiers evaporated into nameless mass graves, the Soviet state tracked its high-value prizes meticulously. 24 German generals surrendered at the ruins of Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was the ultimate trophy. He spent his early captivity in relatively comfortable conditions, living in specialized facilities and advising Soviet military personnel. Survival at this echelon required political currency. Paulus held immense value for his captors. He was the first German field marshal ever taken alive in battle. For the high command, elite status offered physical protection but demanded public ideological submission. Paulus and his immediate subordinate, General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, became primary instruments of Soviet wartime propaganda. Their active participation in anti-fascist committees served Moscow's strategic interests perfectly. The unspoken choice was clear: cooperate politically or lose the critical privileges of rank. Paulus eventually yielded. Following the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, he signed a public appeal against the Nazi regime. He later relocated to the GDR, passing away in Dresden in 1957. Seydlitz went much further in his political alignment. He took the position as president of the League of German Officers. His highly vocal commitment to the Soviet cause provoked immediate retaliation from Berlin. A German military court sentenced Seydlitz to death in absentia for high treason in 1944. He expected his extensive collaboration to guarantee a swift return home. The reality proved entirely different. Soviet authorities eventually arrested him on historical war crimes charges. In 1950, a military tribunal handed him a 25-year prison sentence. The political utility of these commanders had a strict expiration date. Seydlitz served 5 years of that term before his early release. He returned to West Germany in 1955. Not all Stalingrad commanders faced the bitter dilemma of Soviet captivity. General Hans Valentin Hube commanded the armored forces trapped inside the pocket. Hitler personally ordered his immediate extraction. High Command considered his tactical experience too valuable to lose in the impending military collapse. A transport plane flew Hube out of the frozen encirclement before the final surrender. He escaped the Soviet camps entirely. Yet his reprieve lasted barely 3 months. Hube died in an aviation accident in April 1944.
Even for those escaping sudden death, the choice of survival strategy within the general's circle determined their subsequent route. Chief of Staff Arthur Schmidt surrendered in 1943, yet he survived until 1987. Through 4 decades in West Germany, he maintained a stubborn silence, refusing almost every opportunity to speak publicly about his captivity. His strict refusal to cooperate with Soviet authorities exacted a heavy toll on his fate. Schmidt's deliberate non-compliance led directly to the show trial of the 12 generals in 1947. The tribunal handed him a 25-year sentence, but he served only 8 years before his release in 1955. Other commanders faced entirely different timelines within the same prison facilities. General Moritz von Dreber fell severely ill upon capture and perished in captivity in 1943, barely months after the surrender. Meanwhile, General Alexander von Daniels faced the identical 1947 tribunal. He received a 10-year sentence that he partially served before his early release in the 1950s. The repatriation of these high-ranking officers and the remaining survivors officially concluded in 1956.
Those 6,000 men who returned home after a decade in Soviet camps found their personal experience interpreted entirely differently across a divided nation. In 1942, they marched out to kill. In 1955, they returned to West Germany as the official victims of a madman's war. The foundation of this new national myth was laid not by politicians, but by writers. Heinrich Gerlach published The Forsaken Army in 1957. The novel depicted the Sixth Army abandoned in the snow, freezing, starving, and stripped of ammunition. This specific image of soldiers betrayed by their own command became a convenient political shield. They were no longer the vanguard of an extermination campaign. They were ordinary men sacrificed on the altar of ideology. This literary reinvention perfectly matched the post-war needs of Konrad Adenauer's government. West Germany had to rebuild its armed forces. It had to integrate millions of veterans into a new democratic society while distancing the state from the SS. In 1951, Adenauer's administration passed laws explicitly separating the regular army from the regime's atrocities. This legalized the creation of the Bundeswehr. The narrative required a clean break, and the frozen ruins of Stalingrad provided the perfect alibi. The state presented the returning prisoners as men trapped by a criminal leadership. The psychological need to wash away collective guilt required simplification. The reality of the Eastern Front involved active participation in mass death. The new narrative erased that completely. The focus shifted entirely to the suffering of the German soldier in the encirclement. This specific focus allowed society to grieve without confronting the original crimes. The novels, memoirs, and political speeches merged into a single, undeniable version of the past. The literary canon of Stalingrad was firmly established and remained unchallenged for decades. That established literary canon dominated the West, while East Germany officially banned the image of the victimized soldier. The West mourned betrayed men. The East celebrated the captive officers of the National Committee as the founders of socialism. This dual mythology crumbled when the Hamburg Institute for Social Research launched an exhibition detailing military complicity in mass atrocities. It toured the country from 1995 to 1999. Over 800,000 visitors walked through the halls, confronting visual evidence that disproved both narratives. The silence finally broke. For decades, the divided nation had forged two conflicting narratives from one national trauma. Both states carefully manipulated the memory of the prisoners to advance their post-war political strategies. The East had long suppressed the grim camp experience to avoid offending their Soviet allies. This silent consensus held firm until a younger generation of historians demanded verifiable facts. They drew on the momentum of the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, which had prosecuted 22 former camp officials between 1963 and 1965. Neither ideological fable could withstand the fall of the Berlin Wall. Following the political shift of 1991, international researchers finally bypassed the old barriers and gained access to the restricted Soviet records. The truth emerged slowly. They physically opened the NKVD folders detailing the exact mortality figures.
91,000 prisoners were captured at Stalingrad. Not all of them spoke German. Those unsealed Soviet registries held far more than just Wehrmacht records. The sprawling camp system swallowed soldiers from across the entire Axis alliance. Here, survival depended on a dark, absurd bureaucratic hierarchy. Nationality and political upheavals back home dictated the odds of living another day. Yesterday's sworn enemies suddenly became valuable political resources. Consider the Romanian troops caught in the Soviet camps. King Michael's coup in August 1944 triggered an immediate armistice. This instantly flipped the Romanian army from invaders to allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. For men freezing behind barbed wire, this diplomatic shift altered reality overnight. Soviet authorities approached this paradox with cold, calculated pragmatism. These survivors became political building material for the new communist regime in Bucharest.
The Italian Eighth Army faced its own bureaucratic nightmare. Their nation surrendered in September 1943, splitting the homeland in two. The Southern Kingdom sided with the Allies, while Mussolini's Republic remained under German control. Commanders classified Italian captives differently depending on the shifting timeline. Their lives became basic bargaining chips in an ideological war. Hungarian prisoners endured a delayed but similar process. Their government failed to negotiate a separate peace throughout 1944. German forces occupied their territory, sealing the fate of Hungarian captives in the east. They shared the same freezing barracks and high mortality rates as the German soldiers. The repatriation only began in slow waves after 1947.
Ultimately, nationality forged a strict hierarchy of suffering behind barbed wire. Political maneuvers in distant capitals decided who would eventually board a train west. The Soviet camps processed men based strictly on changing front lines. Survival became an administrative lottery. Exactly 6,000 German men finally crossed the border back home. Those 6,000 survivors carried the Eastern Front directly into their own living rooms. A stranger sat down at the kitchen table, facing a wife who had aged a decade and children who no longer remembered his face. The physical absence had lasted more than 10 years, leaving a permanent gap in the household structure. Some women had already remarried after receiving official notices of death years earlier, and they now found themselves legally bound to two different men. For those families that remained intact, the reunion quickly became a quiet tragedy of estrangement. The family arranged the dinner plates in an uneasy atmosphere. The returned father chewed his food without making eye contact, radiating a tense quietness that filled the entire room. In the Soviet camps, a single careless word could invite a death sentence, and that instinct of extreme caution had anchored itself in their minds.
They refused to speak about the interrogations, the forced labor, or the comrades they had buried in the frozen dirt. This defensive quietness became a permanent barrier between the men and the families who desperately tried to understand their behavior. This was not an isolated domestic issue, but a deep psychological fracture spanning an entire generation. When the last major transports arrived in late 1955, thousands of men walked off the trains carrying unrecognized mental wounds. The clinical vocabulary to describe their condition simply did not exist at the time. The medical community would not officially classify post-traumatic stress disorder until 1980, leaving these veterans without a diagnosis for decades. They lived their remaining years unable to articulate the horrors they had witnessed. The children inherited only the silence. That inherited silence echoed inside empty bank accounts. How do you compensate for a stolen youth? The Federal Republic attempted to translate years of captivity into pension points. Men drafted into the Wehrmacht at 18 or 20 returned home at 30 or 35. They missed their education. They lost their defining professional years to the freezing barracks of the Soviet Union. In 1950, West Germany passed the Heimkehrergesetz, the returnees law. The government tried to provide financial support and housing, calculating camp time toward future retirement. Bureaucracy stepped in to mend broken biographies. East Germany managed the survivors differently. The GDR offered a strict political bargain instead of financial comfort. Prisoners who survived Soviet re-education programs integrated smoothly into socialist party structures. Those who refused found themselves permanently marginalized. State authorities demanded active confirmation of the official anti-fascist narrative. Reintegration required ideological obedience. The physical reality of their return eventually yielded to biology. The last direct voices of Stalingrad faded away through the 1990s and early 2000s. Their lived trauma transitioned into cold archival files and academic debates. The 90th anniversary of the battle will arrive in 2033. By that date, the number of living witnesses will be 0. While politicians in Bonn calculated future pension scores for the few survivors, archival folders preserved a very different accounting of human time. A healthy adult heart weighs approximately 300 grams under normal conditions. When extreme starvation sets in, the failing body begins to literally devour its own cardiac muscle, shrinking the organ until the heartbeat slows to a fatal crawl. The Viennese physician Hans Diebold stood over the wooden cots and stared at the paradoxical edema. The body of the patient swelled with heavy fluid, purely from severe hunger. Captured alongside several hundred medical professionals of the Sixth Army, Diebold found himself working in the crude camp infirmaries of the Volga region. The Soviet hospitals suffered from a chronic shortage of qualified doctors, making the captured physicians highly valuable for daily operations. Diebold examined patients who had lost nearly all their muscle mass to the freezing marches and meager rations.
He pressed his fingers against the swollen, fluid-filled legs that contrasted grotesquely against the prominent ribs and skeletal frames of the prisoners. His clinical notes recorded the severe apathy of the men, observing it as both a neurological symptom of severe caloric deficit and a necessary psychological defense mechanism. He improvised primitive treatments using materials that any standard European hospital of the era would have thrown into the incinerator immediately. His 1949 book, Doctor in Stalingrad, became one of the most detailed medical records of how captivity systematically dismantled the human body. The most devastating medical crisis occurred not during the long periods of deprivation, but when sudden supplies of rations finally reached the wooden barracks. Diebold witnessed the fatal consequences of a completely depleted body receiving a sudden influx of calories.
The resulting electrolyte imbalance shocked the weakened cardiovascular network, completely overwhelming the critically diminished cardiac tissue. He watched a skeletal prisoner receive a sudden thick portion of food after weeks of near starvation. The man eagerly swallowed the heavy meal, and his shrunken heart simply stopped beating. Hans Diebold was not the only German physician trying to halt epidemics deep in the Soviet rear. A Soviet and a German doctor stood over a typhus ward. Mortal enemies discussed treatment protocols using rough gestures and broken Russian. Yelabuga camp in the Urals, located roughly 900 kilometers east of Moscow, housed thousands of Stalingrad captives. It also held massive outbreaks of typhus and dysentery. Soviet camp commanders assigned captured German doctors to manage the growing medical crisis. Their physical capacity to cure patients remained practically non-existent. They lacked basic supplies, no medicine, no clean water. Yet their daily presence established a rudimentary nursing routine in an otherwise chaotic environment. These medical professionals shared common European scientific roots. They had studied similar textbooks before a war of extermination divided their nations. Now they stood side by side in freezing wooden barracks. They agreed on drug dosages through crude sign language and poorly pronounced words. This daily interaction forced a surreal professional collaboration between two hostile sides. Some of these medical exchanges remained strictly functional. Others left quiet marks. Traces of professional respect. Typhus treatment protocols represented only one fraction of Soviet medical interest in the captives. Tens of thousands of bodies freezing in barracks. For physiologists, this was an unprecedented database. The mechanism differed from the active torture of the SS or Japan's Unit 731. Soviet doctors did not engineer the suffering, they observed it. Winter temperatures in the Urals routinely dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. This environment created a massive natural laboratory. Soviet physiologists transferred clinical data on severe frostbite from the wooden barracks directly into academic research folders. The dry rustle of NKVD papers filled the medical offices. Each page contained precise body temperature logs of dying men. The state required hard facts on human endurance for its future Arctic expansion projects.
Doctors extracted detailed medical information on physiological reactions to deep frost directly from the fading prisoners. They tracked the exact stages of extreme starvation. These collected statistics fueled post-war Soviet studies on the physiology of environmental stress. Researchers quantified every shivering breath. The captive soldiers formed an involuntary research population.
The physical exploitation of the Stalingrad captives did not end within the medical records of the NKVD, but instead transitioned into a cold political currency. The promise of safety in exchange for wartime collaboration turned into a lengthy prison sentence the exact moment a captive lost his propaganda value. Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach stood as a prominent Soviet collaborator throughout the 1940s. He broadcasted direct appeals to the Wehrmacht across the front lines and helped establish the National Committee for a Free Germany alongside exiled German communists. His extensive service provided no immunity when the borders of the Cold War hardened. By 1950, his practical utility as a cooperative voice expired. Soviet tribunals tried and convicted him to 25 years of imprisonment. The justice was transactional. The legal system operated on diplomatic convenience rather than actual precedent. Meanwhile, the Soviet administration utilized a different subset of compliant captives for a highly specific political purpose. They integrated selected ideological converts to help form the foundational bureaucracy and security apparatus of the new East German state. Across the divided border, the absence of the remaining prisoners fueled a different political engine. In 1950, the Federal Republic of Germany was still carefully constructing its state institutions for a population of over 50 million people amid the post-war rubble. Streets in the rebuilding western cities, like Frankfurt and Cologne, featured stark posters displaying the sketched faces of missing soldiers. Wives and mothers organized public rallies with placards demanding the immediate return of their husbands from the Siberian camps. This visible public grief transformed into an organized electoral resource for Chancellor Konrad Adenauer and the CDU. The Verband der Heimkehrer, an organization representing former prisoners of war and recent returnees, consolidated these fractured families into a formidable pressure group. They officially lobbied the federal government in Bonn and submitted formal political demands for comprehensive economic compensation. The pressure for compensation pushed the federal government into action. In 1955, Konrad Adenauer flew to Moscow to exchange diplomatic recognition for living men. Nikita Khrushchev waited at the negotiating table. The Soviet leader needed international legitimacy. The Stalin era was over. Moscow wanted to project a cooperative image. Adenauer needed the prisoners. Western integration could not mean abandoning Germans in Soviet camps. The two leaders made a pragmatic deal: normalization of relations for human cargo. West Germany turned this exchange into a state policy. Across the border, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany handled the returnees differently. The German Democratic Republic held a population of about 17 million people. Integrating thousands of broken soldiers posed a severe political risk. The SED demanded total submission to the official anti-fascist myth. Prisoners who collaborated with Soviet re-education programs became public heroes.
They joined the party ranks. The rest faced a wall of silence. East Berlin erased their camp trauma from public discourse. Officials framed their suffering as the direct consequence of Nazi aggression. They remained an uncomfortable element in a new state. The West chose another path. The 1955 precedent established a long-term mechanism. The Federal Republic began negotiating directly with East Berlin. West German cash flowed eastward, while political prisoners moved westward. The transactions were cold and bureaucratic. Between 1963 and 1989, the West German government routinely paid for political prisoners using hard currency. 33,000 bought lives. These currency transactions shaped two parallel memories existing on a single fractured territory. For 40 years, two states constructed mutually exclusive narratives about the exact same soldiers. West Germany wrote a history centered on the agonizing suffering of the Sixth Army. East Germany fabricated a victorious chronicle regarding the ideological birth of socialist construction. 155 kilometers of concrete separated these conflicting state myths. The reality of captivity became either a convenient tragedy or a mandatory triumph, depending entirely on the border. Reunification in 1990 shattered both ideological facades. Starting in 1991, researchers finally gained access to the newly opened Soviet state repositories. Simultaneously, independent scholars untied the dusty folders containing classified Stasi and SED documents. The resulting evidence proved noticeably darker than the Western myth of innocent victims or the Eastern fable of anti-fascist heroes. Propaganda dissolved under the weight of administrative paperwork. Historians began to compile the final casualty figures. Search teams dug into Russian soil throughout the 1990s. Workers stood in muddy trenches across former battlefields. They uncovered physical remains missing since the winter of 1943. A joint German-Russian project began to cross-reference these nameless graves with fading Soviet military rosters. The calculations finally revealed the demographic void. Out of 91,000 registered prisoners, only about 6,000 men survived. Standard paper envelopes began arriving in German mailboxes. Decades after the guns fell silent, families finally received printed administrative notices. The documents stated exactly where their husbands and sons lay buried in foreign earth. The collapse of the captured army happened in distinct chronological phases. 35,000 to 45,000 men died in the first 3 months alone. They perished on forced marches across the frozen steppe. Most collapsed before even reaching the permanent holding facilities. Trains distributed the surviving 46,000 to 56,000 soldiers across the vast GUPVI camp network. These isolated labor complexes stretched from the European part of the Soviet Union deep into the Urals and Central Asia. Inside those wire perimeters, mortality rates remained high throughout 1943 and 1944. The daily death toll only declined gradually starting in 1945. The Soviet state held thousands of men back for post-war reconstruction labor. Others faced intense political re-education programs designed to break old loyalties. Repatriation for these remaining individuals dragged on for an entire decade. The final bulk of captives crossed the western border only between 1955 and 1956.
They returned home following Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's diplomatic negotiations in Moscow. The translation of these statistics leaves no room for interpretation. A survival rate of 6 to 7% meant an entire generation simply evaporated. From a standard German infantry company of 150 soldiers, only 8 or 9 walked back. 6 survivors out of 100. 93 or 94 dead for every 100. The mathematics of Stalingrad remain one of the most extreme records of mortality in captivity for the entire 20th century. This death rate surpassed even the broader destruction of Soviet prisoners in German camps, which reached 57%. The men who surrendered did not walk into gas chambers or execution trenches. They entered a slow physical collapse where multiple overlapping factors guaranteed their death. The German High Command had already starved its own troops for weeks before the final capitulation. When the columns finally moved eastward, the physical condition of the captured soldiers was already compromised beyond recovery. The winter of 1943 brought temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius across the ruined region. Men marched through the snowstorms without proper winter clothing or adequate daily rations. Soviet authorities lacked the food reserves and medical facilities required to absorb such a massive influx of starving captives. The detention camps operated within a war-torn nation, facing total resource deficits. Rations simply did not exist. Survival for starving individuals became impossible under these specific material conditions. Those who survived the initial death marches found themselves absorbed directly into a network of punitive labor camps. The Soviet government turned these remaining prisoners into a primary workforce for reconstructing ruined infrastructure. Guards enforced heavy physical labor quotas, regardless of the prisoners' severe malnutrition or widespread chronic illnesses. Responsibility for this specific catastrophe fractures across the leadership that ordered the hopeless stand, the freezing climate, and the camp administration. The Eastern Front generated a scale of devastation that eroded traditional moral boundaries completely. Victim and executioner became indistinguishable. When survival replaced morality on the Eastern Front, 91,000 prisoners became mere lines in administrative ledgers. A 20-year-old non-commissioned officer finally stepped off a train at age 35. He returned to a rebuilt Federal Republic of Germany. His hometown was completely reconstructed, and his family had long learned to live without him. Behind the massive statistics lay entirely different human fates. A Bavarian soldier died of dysentery on the freezing banks of the Volga. A Berlin officer learned Russian and survived by building concrete bridges in the Urals. The bureaucracy actively erased individual identities long before physical death. A Soviet clerk wrote a German surname by ear into a standard NKVD registration card. Cyrillic characters permanently altered the original spelling. When the tracing service, Deutsche Dienststelle, translated those documents back years later, the names became completely unrecognizable. Relatives searched for men who officially no longer existed on paper. Thousands of archival entries simply carried the same cold stamp. They read, "Missing in the East. Death unconfirmed." Back home, the wooden mailboxes remained empty. Field letters abruptly stopped arriving after the winter of 1943. Families faced a daily silence. They learned to interpret this absence, but they desperately refused to confirm the obvious outcome. The Sixth Army formally ceased to exist in February 1943. Yet the history of its captive men stretched much further. The last registered prisoner from Stalingrad arrived in Germany only in 1956. The final survivor passed away sometime in the 1990s or 2000s, without any official record establishing his exact identity. A battle lasting 6 months left a trace for half a century. That half-century trace now dominates modern historical debates. 91,000 fates form one of the heaviest documents of the war to process. The argument over guilt focuses on one crucial nuance. Historians sift through yellowed military orders looking for a specific directive. They find a massive logistical collapse rather than a targeted extermination policy. Captivity killed through a lack of foresight and extreme physical exhaustion. Yet the authorities fully knew that men were dying in massive numbers. Daily reports confirmed the soaring mortality rates across the scattered camps. The emergency rescue measures always arrived too late. Trainloads of medicine missed their scheduled destinations. Rations increased only after bodies already filled the mass graves. The legal distinction between a direct order to kill and criminal negligence matters immensely to international tribunals. Intent defines a formal war crime. But this judicial nuance does not change the final count of corpses stacked in the frozen trenches. Closed folders still lie untouched inside the archives of former Soviet states. Their dusty covers hide pages of empty profiles and missing photographs. These hidden papers might eventually adjust the exact statistical figures. They will never alter the fundamental verdict. The bureaucracy killed through sheer apathy, starving prisoners without an execution mandate. Sometime in the 2000s, the last surviving veteran of that march drew his final breath. His real name vanished into the paper trail, remaining unknown forever.